Shall we start off by talking about this drone attack? What more do we know?
Yeah, the Russians sustained 3.5-hour series of attacks on the Danube port complexes, we understand. Ukrainians say that 2 people have injured. The Ukrainians claim they've shot down 22 of the 25 drones, but inevitably these drones fall and cause a lot of damage along the way. Now, the Danube is being used to export grain because the original exit route was across the Black Sea. Ever since Putin withdrew from the grain deal, they've had to find other ways of moving it. What's slightly confusing is President Putin's meeting President Erdogan of Turkey tomorrow. One of the things we think they're going to be talking about is trying to find ways that they could get the grain deal back going again. But the harsh reality is Russia is clearly targeting grain. If supplies go down, prices go up. Russia is the #1 exporter of grain in the world, so it benefits it, even though it's causing a global food crisis along the way.
Let's talk about the counteroffensive while Russia does this. So obviously, Ukraine trying to get the upper hand. We talked about the counteroffensive for weeks now, but not really having any effect, is it?
It's not, and trying to see what the metrics of success are for this is key. So looking at objectively rather than subjectively. And that's clearly about liberating territory. That's what this whole focus is about. So there are going to be 3 main areas, I think, when we're looking at territory, one of which is down in Crimea. Now, this is an area that Russia will not want to give up and that will fight to the death, so it's probably not a priority for Ukraine. Up in the north of Donbass, particularly around Kupiansk, the Russians have been trying to be on the front foot there. Again, Ukraine could fight there intensely, but the closer they get to the Russian border, the more difficult it will be to do. So the biggest bang for buck they're going to get is by liberating the land bridge, which is obviously between Crimea and the Donbass. And that's why the Ukrainians have crossed the Dnieper River and why there's intense fighting around the Robotyne area. But as we find ourselves currently 12 weeks in, largely remain static. Now, the 3 factors that I think we're going to come into play now, one of which is time. The closer we get to the autumn, winter, the rainy season, the territory becomes like a mud bath, and that will preclude manoeuvre warfare. So, and the other thing is, just because the Ukrainians will get through this, the defences here, they've actually got to get themselves to the south coast, and even when they get there, they've got to protect their flanks. So all of that takes time, and they'll need to get that sorted before winter, which will be a critical area. The second one is weapons. The Ukrainians are burning through 500,000 kilograms of artillery every single day. The West has got a fair supply that they've already provided, but come out of war stock. You can't nip down to the supermarket to replace them, so that's going to be a limitation. And the third thing is troops. Russia is a Goliath compared to Ukraine's David, but even Russia is struggling to recruit. Now, we've just heard that they've been recruiting 280,000 more soldiers since January, but they've also been recruiting from Armenia and Kazakhstan. And the one thing that Ukraine cannot afford to do is get itself locked into a grinding war of attrition. They have already suffered huge casualties on the battlefield. On the offence, you lose 3 times as many as you do on defence, and that's something that's not sustainable in the long term, and that's what they've got themselves trapped into at the moment.
So if there's no major breakthrough, how will that shape the war going forward?
Great question. At the moment, from the West perspective, they still are backing President Zelensky for the long term, and actually the commitment for F-16s and the like is something that demonstrates their commitment. But the risk is that Ukrainian military is being hammered hard at the moment, and the danger is if they lose too much military capability, it'll embolden Russia to do a counter-offensive and actually push the Ukrainians back even further. But it is worth remembering there is domestic pressure from Russian oligarchs. They've seen the Russian economy tank, and therefore they are apparently applying more and more pressure on President Putin to find some way to bring the war to an end. There's 2 ways this could, if there is no progress by Ukraine by the winter, either you end up in a frozen conflict for the winter where both sides don't move and then they set about having another go in spring, but both the defensive lines will be even more robust if that was the case, and it's very difficult to see how any progress will be made. Or again, if there's been no progress by winter, there could be efforts to try to pursue some sort of peace out of this. Neither of these 2, Putin or Zelensky, are going to be keen on pursuing a peaceful, but we can expect to see growing international pressure if there isn't some sort of progress in the war. That pressure will mount as winter approaches.
Yeah, coming from the international community. All right, Sean, thank you very much indeed.